welcome to today's episode of the Proptech Pioneers. So today's show will be on the topic of how property managers and operators can leverage tech to gain a competitive advantage in a tough market, which it is these days. We're lucky to be joined today by Osborne, previously Managing Director at Colliers International, where he worked on some of the largest development projects across what I believe is Asia and Europe before taking the leap to start your own Proptech company, my Proptech. So Ashley, super grateful to have you on board and welcome on this early morning.
Hi Marcus, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good, so we'll kick off. We've got about 30 minutes and I guess to start off as a bit of an introduction, could you tell us a bit about Colliers and you're nearly 18 years there, and why you ultimately also ended up jumping the ship to start your own Proptech company?
Sure. So I was at Colliers for a very long period of time. I think I had two real jobs there, but the one that most people will know me for is my time in the project marketing new development space. So I established a new division at Colliers International called International Properties, selling projects from all over the world to investors in Asia. And at the time I was based in Hong Kong. We worked with developers principally from Australia and the UK, promoting projects to investors that really wanted to buy property for their investment purposes, so to generate an income over a long period of time. Over time, that business grew into one of the largest sales businesses in Asia, and ultimately I moved to the UK, where I managed both the sales business in Asia, but also a much larger business in the UK, providing land to developers, working in the build-to-rent space, and also having a small sales operation in the UK.
Good. I mean, you don't look that old, as a compliment at the top of the morning.
Thank you. I'm lucky. I think I was just lucky that I started early in my real estate career.
Yeah. Where are you from, Ashley? Just
so I'm originally
curious.
From Australia. So I spent my most of my youth and young years in Australia. After graduating from university, I then moved to the UK, and I've spent many years working in different places. So principally London, Singapore, Hong Kong, and a little bit of time in Sydney.
Yeah, no, good. International. I mean, the what you did at Colliers is incredibly exciting, and we'll dig into the topic of property management today, right? And how tech can make you an even better operator and property manager. But just to dig a bit more into you, I mean, how come you actually took the leap to jump this exciting, comfortable ship?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting move. I think it's one of those moves that not many people make. But look, I think at the core, what I saw was really a two-tier real estate market where the property market only works for a very small group of people. And I think it's quite unfortunate because you've got this group of people that are first-time buyers. They want to get on the housing ladder. They're finding it virtually impossible at the moment. And also you've got investors that people think that they get a much better deal than what they do, but they actually don't. And they're actually much more useful in providing new property than what people think. And it's just a very small group of very wealthy funds, high net worth individuals that really get access to all of the information, the tools, and they've got the buying power that nobody else does. And I really thought that there was a way to provide a better route to market for those people. So that's what we created. And I just kind of, in my heart, knew that working in a large corporate, it wasn't the right environment to try and build that sort of technology. Because I knew in order to do something, it would have to be tech-led. And I kind of understood, having been involved in various tech projects in Colliers over the years, that it wasn't the right environment to build a technology platform because it didn't have access to the sort of capital that was required, the sort of people, but also, building tech products is also about a willingness to want to do it as well. And it requires a huge amount of, belief in a product and also change. And, these older companies, they've got a very well-established way of doing business. They've got very clear revenue streams, and trying to marry up something that's, at the other end of the scale is very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, we couldn't agree more, right? We've seen exactly the same in Unloc. It's it's a fairly old-fashioned industry, used to its ways of working, and gotten used to its problems and looking at it.
Absolutely, and I think, look, that will change, I think, quite rapidly over the next few years, because I think there's an expectation with consumers now that whether it's a tech company or a traditional real estate business, that they will be able to provide these services that people want. So it's going to change whatever people think.
Yeah, no, good. Excited that you've started this, and to dig into the topic then of a bit more under the hood of what Colliers did well, especially when it came to property management. What in your opinion did they do well, and what did they to put it?
So it's very interesting. So at Colliers, we had a very different approach to property management than most other companies, and I think it was about access to capital, but also appetite for risk. So what Colliers did was worked in partnership with two separate local property managers in the UK. And it was quite interesting because they were very different. One was a centralized tech-led business. I'm not going to use their names because I don't think that's fair. And the other one was a more traditional property manager with a series of offices and little shop fronts around the UK where they provided traditional sales and letting services. I think what both companies did very well was, they're very good at customer care. So at the point that a landlord becomes a client, they're very good at dealing with that. They're very good at advertising property for rent and making sure that, people can see the product that's available and dealing with those inquiries. And they're good at getting a tenant. But I think where the rubber hits the road and somebody's actually operating the property, I think a lot of them really struggle. And, the thing that I've seen over the years is that there's so many parts to property management that what companies tend to do is they either try and do it physically themselves with people, which I think is really challenging now. But the other thing is they use technology, and they have various technology platforms that do part of the process, and then it requires a person to integrate the next platform that does the next part of the process. And I think that's where a lot of these property managers fall down at the moment. It's just understanding technology, having the people to actually implement the technology in the business. And then actually, once you've done those things, the key is actually using it and getting your people to use the technology and making sure that you're doing that. And I think that's where a lot of these property managers fall down. And the problem is, as a consequence, their customer, and they've got a couple of customers. They've got the customer who's the ultimate landlord or owner of the property, and also the customer that's the tenant. They tend to have generally quite bad experiences because there is this gap with service delivery, and I've seen that quite a lot over the years.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, what do you think are the biggest challenges then facing property managers today in the housing market that is right in front of us? Zooming in on the UK and how to best tackle it.
Look, I think in the UK it's a really interesting market because there's a lot of change going on in the UK generally. So we've got a lot of new legislation being introduced, which is definitely probably the biggest challenge for people that manage property on behalf of their clients. It comes with a little legal responsibility as well. So whether that's things like making sure that tenancies are compliant, things like deposits are properly registered, making sure that the gas and safety certificates, all those sorts of things that need to be done are done effectively. That's one of the challenges. Plus, the legislation keeps changing. So we're in an ever-moving environment where these property managers have got to stay on top of all of the things that are coming down the system as well. The other thing as well is we're talking about having licensing being introduced for property managers as well. So they need to make sure that their staff are adequately not only trained, but also licensed. So there's all these things coming down the line, as well as a very complex market. So a lot of landlords are leaving the market in the UK at the moment because, again, they've got their own challenges at the moment. And also there's a huge amount of demand from tenants. So it's just the amount of work that they've got to deal with and then knit all of those different parts of their business together. So that's listing a project, doing all of the work that needs to be done to get it on the market for rent, then getting the tenant, making sure the tenant then complies with all of the necessary legislation, and then also managing the property both from a perspective that the tenant gets what they want, which is quiet enjoyment of the property, but also that they're able to report to their client as well and deal with the inquiries. And I think that's actually a huge amount of work. And what these companies can't do particularly well at the moment, from what I've seen, is knit all of those processes together. And that's, I think, their biggest challenge.
Yeah. Why is this all happening right now? I mean, why is this? You've fair to say, right? You've lived a little bit longer than me, Ashley. But in my head, this is a bit. In my head, this is a bit of a perfect storm, right? There's so many angles attacking and putting pressure on the real estate market. Why is this happening all now?
To a certain extent, I think this is happening everywhere. I think the market dynamics are the same in most major markets. So if you look around the world, if you look at places like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, US, they all have the same challenge where there's just not enough rental property being generated in the market. There's a credit crisis. There's a crunch on living expenses at the moment, which means that affordability is a major issue. But the UK, it's fair to say, has more challenges because, one, whether people believe in Brexit or not, the reality is it did have an impact on the market. So it has driven less capital from the market. There's been a huge amount of change in legislation as well, which has driven landlords from the market. And then at the same time, the UK's got a lot of older housing stock, which doesn't meet a lot of the new environmental standards that are coming through. And there's been a really tragic incident in the UK as well called Grenfell Tower, which a building caught on fire, and unfortunately a lot of people lost their lives. And I think it brought a lot of focus on just how well or otherwise people are managing properties. So you're right, it's a perfect storm. Plus we've got obviously inflation, we've got the aftermath of COVID as well coming through the system. So yeah, it feels like the real estate market's in for a relatively turbulent time over the next few years, particularly in the UK.
How can property managers then secure a competitive edge in this market?
I actually think there's only one way, really, that property managers can really get ahead in the space, and it's through the use of technology. Because the reality is every property manager says the same thing, right? They say, we've got great customer service, we've got, we're great at finding tenants, we're the best at doing what we do, we know the space or whatever. But the reality is the only way you're going to survive as a property manager in this space is either doing one of two things: reducing price, and competing on price is a terrible space to be, right? So the only other thing you can do is improve your operational efficiency. I think there's a huge amount that can be done for a lot of these companies, and using technology, embracing technology, and actually integrating it within your processes within the business is the only way I think property managers are going to survive over the coming months and years ahead.
Yeah. And why isn't everyone doing this then?
It's actually quite an interesting question, and I think I would have had a different answer 3 years ago before I started the Proptech to now. And the obvious thing is to say that, yes, this is an obvious thing to do and everybody should do it. But the reality is it's really difficult for companies to adapt. The technology, it's not necessarily clear for people to understand what's the right technology for them to use. And there's not a lot of tech savvy people within the real estate industry. And what you tend to find is there's people that understand real estate really well. They understand the product, what it does, all those sorts of really interesting things. But tech people are ultimately engineers. They speak a very different language. They've got a very different way of dealing with things. It's very logical. And marrying those two things together is very difficult. It's quite challenging. And there's also a cost element involved as well. So I think a lot of property managers and real estate agents generally are struggling with what is the right technology, and then even if I did find the right technology, how do I get my business to adapt to it? And I think those are the challenges that these companies have.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I guess the inevitable here that, or if I were to ask the question, what sets successful property managers apart from those who struggle? I guess the inevitable is they're able to work and implement tech into their companies, but but how? What's the actual kind of digging under the hood dynamics that they have within their companies to do this?
I think to be honest, I think it's about control. So whilst I was at Colliers, we introduced a couple of relatively large tech platforms, principally around the CRM space. And I think the problem that a lot of these companies have is that they tend to operate a whole bunch of silos. So, for example, while I was at Colliers, I was running the residential business principally across the UK and all of Asia. As somebody that was leading that business, my reward, if you like, and the way that I was compensated was all about making my business work and feeding up to a bigger machine. There was never an element that said, if somebody else's business, the other silo in our business does well, there's something in it for you. And I think that, that top-down leadership approach doesn't exist in many companies. So you tend to have the carrot that you create when you introduce technology and you say, this is going to be really good for the business and, everybody should embrace it. But the reality is when the rubber hits the road, a lot of those different silos within the business have got different objectives. So they tend to not necessarily, it's not that they don't want to, but, it doesn't really affect how they're compensated and all those sorts of things. And you've either got to create another carrot, which incentivizes everybody to use it, or a stick that basically says, if you don't adopt this software, this is perhaps not the place for you to be. And I think a lot of these big corporates are reluctant to take that sort of, approach. So I think that's the big challenge in a lot of these companies. Also, on top of that is layered, the understanding and having the people to actually integrate the technology. And I think at the smaller companies, I think it's they're in a much better position to be able to integrate this technology because it is a much smaller footprint. They tend to be much smaller by the nature of what they do, that they have been far more successful at implementing technology. The partner that we worked with at Colliers that was very tech savvy had also invested in other technology platforms. So they've taken they've been involved in seed rounding, in funding other technology platforms. They understood, I think that technology ultimately was going to change the market. And so they were far more willing to actually get under the hood of what their business did, how they could improve the processes, and making it almost part of the DNA of the business. And I think that's critical. If you can't do that as a small business owner, I think you've got a big problem.
Yeah, well, I think we agree with that. Look, since the introduction of the UK Building Safety Bill, we've seen a huge growth in the amount of property inspections taking place. Is there a way that property managers can ensure maintenance and repairs get completed on time without increasing their cost base? You're talking a lot about operational efficiency. What are your thoughts on this?
I think there is, and I think the reality is for most property managers, and I think if they, if they're honest with themselves as well, they'd probably say this too, is that they are inherently inefficient in their current operation because, even if you look at, the requirement for somebody servicing a boiler or plant or something like that, to have to go and collect keys from, a property manager, unlock the site, get access, arrange access, then return the keys, all those sorts of things. It takes a huge amount of time. And I think the potential for most of these companies to be able to improve their initial internal efficiencies is huge because it's not just more efficient management of independent contractors, all those sorts of things, but it's also shortening the time with void periods, all those sorts of things. I think there's a lot that can be done in that space. And it's just a willingness, I think, to adapt and change.
Yeah. And going back to your first point, Brad, with speaking of Unloc, we started in the Nordics in 2017. I think fair to say you have it in the UK. You have an older building stock than what we do over here. You're better at preserving buildings, essentially, which is good for the environment, but it does require a hell of a lot of more inspections. We
have a lot of old buildings in the UK. You're right. That's a good and bad thing. It's from an aesthetic perspective. It's great. You have a lot of really older buildings that are really look great. But also, what happened in the UK is post the war, there was a demand for a lot of property, as you might imagine. A lot of people were moving back to the UK, and they needed accommodation. So there was a huge amount of accommodation built essentially from the 50s to the 70s in the UK, which was built rapidly, let's say. So it was, the only requirement was we need a lot of housing and we need it quickly. And as a consequence, perhaps quality was one of the things that was left behind as part of that. So there is an element of housing stock that was built 50s, 60s, 70s that's probably no longer fit for purpose. And that probably needs to be regenerated. And then at the same time as well, we do have a lot of older housing stock pre that period, which has remained. Some of it's obviously, several hundred years old. That's not particularly efficient from a environmental perspective or an energy consumption perspective, but it's also very challenging to adapt those buildings because they were built without things like insulation and double glazed windows. And we've got a lot of laws in the UK from a planning perspective that prevent owners being able to implement those new technologies to update buildings.
Yeah, makes sense. I studied in the UK back in 2008 to 2012, and I remember coming to sitting in my dorm room for the first time, and I was thinking, Jesus, it's so cold in here. And I thought, how is this? And this notion of single glazed windows was what first occurred to me that we haven't got in the Nordics, right? Arguably, it's slightly colder over here, but
it's a lot colder from my experience, but.
It's a big job to go about replacing all this and do everything needed inside buildings to upgrade the stock. It is.
It's huge. No, sorry, I was going to.
Yeah, no, sir, go on.
And I was going to say, so, and also what we've got as part of this as well is there's new energy ratings which are being talked about being introduced by the UK government at least, which will require that landlords take their buildings from their existing energy rating. We have an energy certification process in the UK called EPC ratings, and they'll have to take them from below C to C and above in order to even allow them to be let for residential people to occupy the properties. And that's going to be a huge challenge for most landlords. It's, what's required to be done is, not only from a planning perspective, if that's required to actually change the planning, but also having the contractors on the ground, access to those people, access to the materials, and then coordinating all of that work to be done is going to be challenging for most landlords.
In your opinion, Ashley, what's the biggest advantages of using mobile access to manage access to your buildings?
Well, in full disclosure, I'm actually obviously a advisory member on the Unloc board. But the reason I got involved with Unloc because the potential's obvious. And what I really like about technology platforms is if it just makes sense, it's probably right. So there's a lot of other people that I think that have built technology where they didn't necessarily understand the problem or the problem in a whole enough way to be able to build a solution. But the Unloc solution is just so obvious. And that's what I really like about it, because for a property manager, coordinating, things like just having a whole bunch of agents show a property and having to go to the local office, collect the keys, return them, all those sorts of things, it takes away an enormous amount of time and effort involved in that. Likewise, coordinating things like contractors to get into do things like certifications to actually service properties when things go wrong, allowing people to do inspections, all those sorts of things. There's a huge amount of time involved in people going backwards and forwards, collecting keys, getting access. There's an environmental impact. So there's the time involved and the energy, so petrol, all those sorts of things from an ESG perspective. And then finally, it's just the time. So, the less time that you've got, if you're hiring your own contractors, those people on the road rather than inside the building doing the work, it just, the application of this product is obvious. And I think that's the thing that I really like about it.
I remember when we did our first work in the UK with a client, we sat and analyzed receipts from contractors coming in and returning and delivering keys, returning and taking out keys. And we calculated the total amount of trips driven around the Earth to be 120 trips around the Earth per year due to handing over and delivering keys. It's incredible.
Absolutely.
But they don't know this, right? So it's a hidden cost of doing business, and a cost that you've in a lot of cases gotten used to. So why should you bother fixing it now?
Well, I think people have been willing to accept that because there was no alternative. And I think it's a different proposition if you say, I'm willing to accept it now at the moment because there is no alternative, and that's just the way the world works. But the reality is there are alternatives now. It's quite interesting because as a Proptech owner as well, we build the products, right? And we understand the issue, we understand the problems, we build the solutions. It's then up to the market to actually adopt the solutions, and you make the choice, right? You can either save money, time, or whatever it is by using the technology, or you can choose not to make that decision. And, I think that's critical. And I think when they start thinking about, we've got a huge problem in London, especially with traffic. So how much time do I want my contractor to sit in a van driving between sites to go and collect keys, all those sorts of things? There's a massive issue with energy consumption at the moment. So how much do I really want to be burning diesel with all of these cars running around, going backwards and forwards, making these what are essentially unnecessary trips? And then finally, a lot of these companies as well have made claims to stakeholders as well about wanting to be environmentally friendly and do the right thing. And the reality is for your average property manager, they're not going to be able to influence whether the tenants wear grass shoes and run around in grass skirts or whatever. That's just not something that they've got control over. They probably can't control the type of materials that people use when they upgrade properties or whatever, because that's, again, dictated by price. So the reality is the one thing that they've got to be able to do is actually reduce the impact of their own business in managing those sorts of things. And, reduction in fuel consumption is just such an obvious one to do.
Yeah. We're nearing the end of this video podcast, but what would you say then to the listeners, viewers of this show? What are your top three tips for the property managers listening into this podcast?
I think the main thing I would say is, as a property manager, you obviously understand your business exceptionally well, and nobody understands your space or your business as well as anybody else. But, it's incumbent on you to go and understand what other technology exists, because, there are things that can help you, and it's probably more a case of actually being willing to go to the market and see what they are. I think that's the sort of number one thing. The other thing is, just because you know that there's technology there, doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to implement it. So make sure that you understand what's required to do it and what ultimately the use case is and the workflow to do that, because chances are it's more complicated than you think. And if you're not capable of actually doing that, get somebody to help you, because it's really critical. And then I think finally, it's that change management. So, you've got to have, willing staff on the ground, willing tenants, willing consumers that understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. Make a commitment to do it, explain the process to them, and have them engage with the process, because without all of those three elements, from experience, having worked at, a large corporate trying to implement new technology, it's very challenging. And without those three elements, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, good. I think the takeaway also for you and I, right, building Proptech businesses, is to actually work more on showcasing how to actually successfully do change management or integrate tech into companies, not just speak about feature A, B, C, and so on. So that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot that we're sort of learning with our business is that you build the technology and you obviously understand the technology and the problem and the solution much better than anybody else. But you've got to really be able to explain what the outcome is for the end user. So you've got to be able to do more than just say, we do this, there's a problem, and, here you go, log into our website or our SaaS platform, whatever it is, and the solution's there for you. It's actually taking that customer on the journey to say, this is the problem, this is our solution, and the outcome to you, Mr. Consumer or Mrs. Consumer, is X. And being able to communicate that in a very quick way. Unfortunately, we work in a very space now where you've got to be able to communicate your message in 10, 15 seconds now, rather than, some long waffling space. Being able to do that is critical. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of Proptech companies at the moment.
We could sit here for hours, because I'd love to dig into the topic of change management more in detail, but we are nearing the end of the episode. And just to summarize a bit, even with the fair amount of doom and gloom around the UK property market these days, there are some property managers, operators using this as an opportunity to implement tech into their operations, right, in order to manage property portfolios more effectively. And we're seeing them slowly but surely gaining competitive edge over their competitors. But it's not easy. But what's the final, ask or urge that you want to give to viewers to take away after this podcast?
I think it's really interesting time, actually, and this is my third downturn in the property market. So I was in Asia during GFC, and I was a lot younger during the tech bust. And I think, as a business owner or somebody in the business space, I think you've really got to look at what's happening at the moment as an opportunity, and an opportunity to embrace change and to really get to the bottom of what you do as a business and what your customers want. And I think those companies that can do that and go on that journey will survive and probably do much better as a result of what's happening today. And those that can't, I think, will really struggle. And I think it's going to be, particularly in the real estate space, I think we're going to see a real change, and I think technology is going to drive that change. And I think what's going to happen is we've seen fintech explode, right? And essentially, there's been a whole bunch of products that have been created for consumers that were very consumer centric, and they looked at the finance space or that sort of space in a very interesting way, saying, what's the problem for a consumer? And how do we make it cheaper, faster, better, safer for them to operate in this space? What we've seen in Proptech is Proptechs have built platforms that help, agents get more leads, property managers better get a plumber to site or whatever the case is. But very few products have been consumer-centric, really thinking about the problem from a consumer perspective. I personally think that's just about to change. And I think for those companies that aren't thinking about the real estate industry in that way, they might not be around in the next few years. And I think one of the terrifying things for most people in the property industry that they need to think about is their biggest competitor at the moment probably doesn't currently exist. So, it's not likely to be the incumbent at the moment in their space that sort of changes or, gets a new capital stream or whatever and takes a bigger percentage of the market share. It's going to be somebody that's got a much better way at looking at your problem, fixing it in a way that helps consumer in a multiple much bigger than what you can do, and you just won't be able to survive. And I think that's that would be my parting thought for most people in this space.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think we'll see a huge shift to the power going to consumers, or tenants, or residents, and moving away from the power being in the landlord's hands going forward. So interesting insight. Last question, Ashley. What's one thing most people don't know about you?
What do they don't know? I think they know. Most people know that I've spent a lot of time around the world. I think prior to this, I spent a lot of time working, as a cyclist. So prior to this, before I was even in real estate, I used to cycle at a very senior level on the track on the velodrome in Australia. So that's probably one thing that most people don't know. The other thing is, from a business perspective, I think that most people look at our business and think of it in a very different way to the way that we see it. And I think that's the real thing that we want to get across to people, which is that we're not all about investors. We want to create a scenario where everybody gets benefit from what we're trying to do, so that investors are the lead for creating value for people. But we see our product being able to help young people get onto the property ladder for the first time. So that's certainly the vision we have for my Proptech.
Oh, really good. Really interesting. Power to the people. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, and everyone do check out my Proptech after this. Ashley, super glad to have you on board, and we'll speak again soon.